The meaning of original nakedness. Introductory observations about Genesis chapter 2, verse 25. General audience number 11, December 12th, 1979. One can say that the analysis of the first chapters of Genesis forces us in some way to reconstruct the constitutive elements of man's original experience. In this sense, the Yahwist text is by its own character a special source. When we speak of original human experiences, we have in mind not so much their distance in time, as rather their foundational significance. The important thing, therefore, is not that these experiences belong to man's prehistory, to his theological prehistory, but that they are always at the root of every human experience. That is true even though in the unfolding of ordinary human existence we pay little attention to these essential experiences. Indeed, they are so interwoven with the ordinary things of life that we generally do not realize their extraordinary character. Based on the analyses carried out so far, we have already been able to realize that what we have previously called revelation of the body helps us in some way to discover the extraordinary nature of what is ordinary. That is possible because revelation, the original revelation, which has found expression first in the Yahwist account of Genesis chapters 2 and 3, and then in the text of Genesis chapter 1, takes into consideration precisely such primordial experiences that show in a nearly complete way the absolute originality of what the male-female human being is, inasmuch as he or she is human. That is also through the body. The human experiences of the body, as we discover it in the biblical texts quoted above, is certainly located on the threshold of all later historical experience. Nevertheless, this experience also seems to rest on an ontological depth that is so great that man does not perceive it in his own daily life, even if at the same time he presupposes it in some way and postulates it as part of the process of the formation of his own image. Without such an introductory reflection, it would be impossible to define the meaning of original nakedness and to take up the analysis of Genesis chapter 2, verse 25, which says, "Now both were naked, the man and his wife, but they did not feel shame." At first sight, the introduction of this detail, apparently a secondary one, may seem unsuited and misplaced. One might think that this passage cannot compare with what the preceding verses speak about, and that it is in some way out of context. Such a judgment, however, cannot stand up to deeper analysis. In fact, Genesis chapter 2, verse 25 presents one of the key elements of the original revelation, just as decisive as the other elements of the text from Genesis chapter 2, verse 20 and 23, that have already allowed us to determine the meaning of man's original solitude and original unity. To these, one must add as a third element the meaning of original nakedness, which is clearly highlighted in the context, in the first biblical sketch of anthropology. It is not something accidental. On the contrary, it is precisely the key for understanding it fully and completely. Shame, a boundary experience. Precisely this element of the ancient biblical text evidently makes a specific contribution to the theology of the body that absolutely cannot be left out of consideration. Further analyses will confirm this point. Before turning to them, however, I allow myself to observe that precisely the text of Genesis chapter 2, verse 25 expressly demands that we link the reflections on the theology of the body with the dimension of man's personal subjectivity. It is in this sphere, in fact, that consciousness of the meaning of the body unfolds. Genesis chapter 2, verse 25 speaks about this in a much more direct way than other parts of this Yahwist text that we have already defined as the first record of human consciousness. The statement according to which the first human beings, the man and woman, were naked, but still did not feel shame, undoubtedly describes their state of consciousness, or even better, their reciprocal experience of the body. That is, the man's experience of the femininity that reveals itself in the nakedness of the body, and reciprocally the analogous experience of masculinity by the woman. By affirming they did not feel shame, the author intends to describe this reciprocal experience with the greatest precision possible for him. One can say that this type of precision mirrors a fundamental experience of man in the common and pre-scientific sense. but it also corresponds to the demands of anthropology, and in particular of contemporary anthropology, which likes to draw on so-called fundamental experiences such as the feeling of shame. When we allude here to the precision of the account that was possible for the author of the Yahweh's text, we are led to consider the degrees of experience of historical man, who is burdened by the inheritance of sin, which nevertheless have their point of departure from the point of view of method, in the state of original innocence. We observed earlier that by appealing to the beginning, which we are here submitting to a series of contextual analyses, Christ indirectly establishes the idea of continuity and connection between the two states, thereby allowing us to go back, as it were, from the threshold of man's historical sinfulness to his original innocence. Precisely Genesis chapter 2, verse 25 asks us in a particular way to cross that threshold. It is easy to see how this passage, together with the meaning of original nakedness expressed in it, fits into the whole context of the Yahwist narrative. In fact, a few verses later, the same author writes, "Then the eyes of both were opened, and they realized that they were naked. They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths." Genesis chapter 3, verse 7. The adverb "then" indicates a new moment and a new situation that followed the breaking of the first covenant. It is a situation that comes after the failure of the test, connected with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which was at the same time the first test of obedience, that is, of hearing the word in all its truth and of accepting love according to the fullness of the demands of the creative will. This new moment, or new situation, also brings with it a new content and a new quality of the experience of the body, so that one can no longer say they were naked but did not feel shame. Thus, shame is not only one of man's original experiences, but is also a boundary experience. The difference of formulations that separates Genesis chapter 2, verse 25 from Genesis chapter 3, verse 7 is thus significant. In the first case, they were naked but did not feel shame. In the second case, they realized that they were naked. Does this mean that at first they did not realize that they were naked? That they did not reciprocally see the nakedness of their bodies? The significant transformation witnessed to by the biblical text concerning the experience of shame, about which Genesis speaks again, particularly in Genesis chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, takes place on a level that is deeper than the pure and simple use of the sense of sight. A comparative analysis of Genesis chapter 2, verse 25 and Genesis chapter 3 necessarily leads to the conclusion that it is not a question of passing from not knowing to knowing, but of a radical change in the meaning of the original nakedness of the woman before the man and of the man before the woman. This change emerges from their consciousness as a fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? Genesis chapter 3, verse 11. This change directly concerns the experience of the meaning of one's own body before the Creator and creatures. That is confirmed later by the man's words. "I heard the sound of your step in the garden, and I was afraid, because I am naked, and I hid myself." Genesis chapter 3, verse 10. In particular, this change, which the Yahweh's text outlines in such a concise and dramatic way, concerns directly, perhaps in the most direct way possible, the relation between man and woman, between femininity and masculinity. We will have to return to the analysis of this transformation in other parts of our further analyses. Now that we have reached the boundary that cuts across the sphere of the beginning to which Christ appealed, we must ask ourselves whether we can in some way reconstruct the original meaning of nakedness, which constitutes the proximate context in Genesis of the doctrine of the unity of the human being as male and female. This seems possible if we take as a point of reference the experience of shame, as it is clearly presented in the ancient biblical text, namely, as a threshold experience. We will attempt such a reconstruction in the following meditations.